actual ceasefire happening? Because like as soon as they signed the papers, we've heard news about like Israel bombing Gaza again, and then like one of the points that they agreed on was Hamas disarming themselves, which they, I think, apparently refused to do so. Where do you think this is headed?
Can I also add one more
Yes.
question with him so that you can answer both? Maybe it's related as well. As you have rightly said, dates back to 1947. But I would like to take it more on previous time. Like, I really wanted to know what was Queen thinking when this Balfour Declaration was done. Because there is a piece of letter that you can find in Wikipedia saying that it's Queen saying that it's their land. Right?
Not quite. I mean, there are different interpretations of this, but you're right to refer to it as an even more long-standing.
What was on her mind? Like, what was the situation like? Because the world has just transitioned from two empires clashing. Because in First World War was fought between empires, right? And after that clash, few countries emerged. And during the Second World War, as we can see, those countries were fighting wars as a country, not as an empire. So, in this background, like, what was what do you think? I don't know, like, what was Queen Elizabeth thinking about that thing?
Well, I think this is even before Queen Elizabeth, actually.
Yeah.
You know, we go back, but I'm not sure that the king had too much to do with it at the time. But Lord Balfour was someone who had been lobbied by the Zionists in Europe, and particularly in England, to find some sort of place or homeland for the Jews. And that this has been a lobby. The Zionist movement starts in the late 19th century. But, you know, British Jews have been very influential in British government. The bankers, the Rothschilds and others had a lot of influence and political influence. And I think the conventional wisdom is that Balfour felt that there was a possibility of some homeland for Jews who are displaced, you know, across the world and so on, in the Middle East, in an area where historically Israel, which is another word for the Jewish people, had a home. The Bible said so and so on. So he was talking about a homeland. It was never about a state. It was always about a place where they could find refuge and so on. And that language resonated. And of course, the division in the Middle East at that time was between mainly France and Britain, who divided the Middle East between them. And Britain had a mandate over what was called Palestine then. Originally, Palestine had been a province of the Ottoman Empire and so on. But after the First World War, during the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, if you like, had sided with the Germans and effectively had been defeated, Britain later took over a mandate over Palestine, and it became a British colonial territory. So between sort of the end of the First World War and 1948, when Israel was created, it was a period of British rule. And the British ruled over a territory which included Arabs and, of course, this growing number of Jews who came and settled and gradually began to have ambitions for a state, for a future state within the territory of Palestine. So during the period of the 1920s and into the 30s, there were three powers, if you like. There was Britain, which had the control over the territory and regarded as an important staging post to India. There were the Arabs who lived there, and there was a population which by that time did not identify itself as Palestinian particularly. And then there were the Jews. And gradually through the 20s and the 30s, at a time when many other countries were increasingly nationalistic, countries that had been colonies were beginning to rise up. In India, you had the movement in the 20s and the 30s for independence. There were two independence movements growing during the 20s and the 30s in Palestine. One was that of the Arabs, the other one was that of the Jews. And so the British had to contend with both of these aspiring nationalisms. And it became a period of a very considerable conflict. And the British found themselves attacked by Arabs and Jews. The Jews formed what at the time by the British were called terrorist groups. which included some very well-known later figures in Israel.
Prime ministers of Israel.
Indeed, yeah. But they were freedom fighters, rather like Nelson Mandela was, at one point a terrorist. They were also freedom fighters. So there were Arab...
It's been going on.
Arab freedom fighters.
Till now.
There were Jewish freedom fighters. The British were trying to control this. And then there was a series of incidents, including the bombing of a very well-known hotel in Jerusalem where the British used to meet and have drinks and so on. The bombing of the, I think it was the King David Hotel, by one of the Jewish gangs. The British then began to clamp down on this. So you had a three-way struggle, as in fact you had in Northern Ireland, which is another story. So it's a story of colonialism. By 1946-47, the British had had enough. This is the end of the war. They wanted to devolve their responsibilities for colonies. The movement in India was beginning to acquire the momentum, and the British were beginning to retreat. So 1947, India has independence. 1948, Israel is formed out of a struggle and a conflict. So that's, if you like, the deeper history of the conflict. But the Palestinians, as they're now called, because in 1960 their nationalist movement formed the Palestine Liberation Organization. That was the first time they had used the term Palestine as a political identifier, if you like. The Arabs then also began to, if you like, aspire for a state. But they had been displaced by the Israelis or by the Jews in Israel. Israel was a Jewish state, and there was a massive forced exodus into Lebanon, Jordan, and so on. So the Palestinian history, and of course this is a partial version of, it's a particular version I'm giving you, is one where the Palestinian aspirations for nationhood, for statehood, had been frustrated from 1948 onwards. And without going into all the detail, which is probably not necessary for your listeners, the history of the Palestinian struggle continues today. So October the 7th was part, from the Palestinian point of view, of a resistance to Israeli occupation and control and a continuing denial of statehood. Now, Trump and others involved have now managed to achieve some sort of stoppage to the large-scale slaughter in Gaza. And it's being called by those in the West and by Israel a ceasefire. But as you say quite rightly, it's not a complete ceasefire. And government ministers, including Netanyahu, have made it very clear that the story is not over. They continue to have claims to what is known as Greater Israel, which is why they are still involved in bombing in Lebanon and so on, and they're defending their own territories as they see them in Syria. And they will be very reluctant to agree to a new Palestinian state. In fact, it's been made very clear by Netanyahu and others, it's not just one person, that there will be no Palestinian state. Now, to Hamas and to those in the West Bank, because Gaza is only one part of the Palestinian territory, this refusal of the Palestinian state means that they are unprepared to lay down their weapons, and they maintain the right of an occupied people, suppressed people, to resist. So the ceasefire is not an answer. It's very unclear what exactly will happen. But in the meanwhile, as they negotiate about Gaza and its territory, the other part of Palestine under Israeli occupation, the West Bank, the Israeli settlers are beginning to increase their encroachments with the support of the state. And as I say, it's been made, I think, very clear by the Israeli government that there will be no Palestinian state. At the same time, a large number of countries around the world, including now my own country, Britain, recognize, whatever that means, a Palestinian state. So this is a contradiction that remains unresolved.
Also, this has happened all of a sudden, right?